Let me begin by saying, as all of you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, and in terms of my ethics, I remember, I think it was in Yeshiva University when someone told me, do you have any ethics? And I said, I was told in high school I had ethics, and I went to the doctor and I had them removed. And it made life a lot easier for me after that. In terms of what I know about the subject, I think that, what do they say? A little knowledge is dangerous. I have a little knowledge, so I might be very dangerous in this. And in a way, I'm glad it's just a small group. Maybe a couple of other people will join us. So please jump in along the way. It is a discussion. When I came up with the idea of this topic, was, I'm sure, for the same reason that, or the same thinking that all of us were doing, which was, if we go back a week, 10 days ago, one of the big fears that everybody had was, what do we do if we run out of ventilators? Because apparently we were. In a good way, things are getting better. And apparently for this go around, and I'm sure all of us hope it stays that way, there is not going to be a shortage of ventilators. But comes the fall, nobody knows. We're in uncharted territory. In the process of doing a little bit of research for this morning, what I found was there are things that it's all over the place. Some of the guidelines, Alvin, Boker Tov.
Boker Tov.
Yes, some of the guidelines that different states have, and it's largely states. There are almost, and if any of you know differently, again, please jump in, all right? I can see almost all of you. Don't even bother raising your hands, just, jump in. I'd like to think what I'm doing is facilitating a discussion, not teaching. Some of the things that the states have, the little bit I was able to pull up on the computer, some of it is almost meshiga. That's the only professional term I could use. So I'm going to begin by giving you some of the weird things that are out there, okay? In terms of some, and the brunt of what we're going to get into in a couple of minutes is really using New York State and City as an example. The reason using them, in almost everything that I pull up, everybody cites New York State as having the most intricate, the most detailed, whatever you want to call it, rules, guidelines regarding ventilators, okay? Their guidelines, for example, and I'm comfortable telling you, I sure as hell did not read it. The guidelines that most states have, their ventilator usage guidelines, how people are selected, it's usually 10, 15 pages, tops. New York State's is 272 pages, okay? One page for every ventilator. Their committee was made up of doctors. When I say clergy, a large number of rabbis. Most of the rabbis' names I recognize, you would recognize. Almost all of them, Orthodox rabbis, pretty much all coming from either Yeshiva University or rabbis who received a smicha, guys a little bit older, from Moshe Feinstein. So they're, from a Jewish perspective in New York State, relying heavily, if we have, get into that more, on the Orthodox position of those two leaders. But to give you some of the wackiness, okay? In New York State, this is just to start us off. To me, it seems a little meshiga. people who get excluded from using a ventilator, I'm laughing, okay? Those who have cardiac arrest are unresponsive to any kind of intervention, including defibrillators that are, it basically, to me, reads, and tell me if you see it any differently. If you're dead, they're not going to put you on a ventilator.
Exactly.
Okay, so I just found that odd. Alabama, and unfortunately, the southern states, you want to say what's going on, okay? In Alabama, when they address triage, persons with mental retardation are among those who may be poor candidates for ventilator support, as well as people who are declining in terms of physical disability. To me, how does that sound to you?
Like Nazi Germany.
Right, that's exactly, it really concerned me when I read that, but they're not the only one. Other southern states to this day, one of the things, and you want to say maybe 20, 30 years ago, that could have been a factor. Of course, I remember with the early days of AIDS, how the center at the time, the board, the committees, we were going Michigan in terms of how do we deal with AIDS? Nobody knew how to deal with it. But to this day, some southern states, a factor that will negate your being able to go on a ventilator is if you have AIDS. Again, you know, you want to say, what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
Jumping around a little bit. In
You want
Israel,
us to jump around?
yeah, in Israel, Israel seems to leave it up. And those of you who are much more familiar with the hospitals in Israel, jump in. But the little bit I was able to pull up, it sounds like individual hospitals or hospital systems in Israel come up with their own rules regarding it. So, for example, Shaarei Tzedek, they have a rather extensive guideline for the use of not just ventilators, but their whole ethics. The guy in charge of their ethics department, medical ethics units, they call it, is Abraham Steinberg. What I pulled up was what he wrote as their director, okay? He's a physician as well as a rabbi. And again, tell me how you would react to this if you were a patient, okay? The patient is obligated to seek the best possible medical care. We would hope so. He has, or she, the autonomous right to choose his physician and his rabbinic decisor, and has the right to make his personal wishes known. The physician is obligated to treat the patient and must offer the best diagnostic and therapeutic interventions according to his knowledge and judgment. The rabbi is obligated to understand all the facts of the medical questions, to consider the views presented by the patient and the physician, and then to decide according to halachic principles how to proceed in any given decision. His decision, the rabbi's, is binding for the patient and the physician. How do you feel about
Goes
that?
along with don't ask the rabbi.
Yeah, but what they're saying, if I understood it correctly, and tell me how you do that, in Shaarei Tzedek, the rabbi is part of the team. You don't have much of a choice. And the ultimate decision is the rabbi's.
I would think that
But-
would be in really, in circumstances where the patient was terminally ill. I mean, I just don't see that happening with everybody that's in the hospital that's sick. I mean, I think that that comes down to the end of life decisions. I don't see a rabbi deciding what treatment you're going to get.
Could be. And what I also wondered when I was reading it, maybe it's much more common in Israel in terms of looking at it now as, all of us part of the Jewish community. Maybe in Israel, it's much more common you don't get shocked that you meet a physician who happens to also be very well learned Jewishly or also has his smicha.
But didn't it say that the patient has the right to choose their own doctor and their own rabbi? Was that chosen by
I don't know. It didn't say it. In his, it sounded like, no, it's the rabbis, I'm using my term now, the rabbis who are affiliated with Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, but I don't know that. So for example, what you're asking, Debbie, and we'll switch over to the New York one. The New York one is the most detailed, but what I found interesting is they do make exceptions. So for example, Maimonides Hospital in New York, and my brother, whenever he has problems in the nursing home where something happens and they transfer him, it's usually to Maimonides. Maimonides serves pretty much a heavy part of the population from Borough Park and Williamsburg. Whereas in New York, all the decisions are based on this triage committee, which does not have clergy on it. It's a medical situation. In Maimonides, they do allow for the families, and I guess they're reacting to the community they serve, the religious questions or questions regarding end of life, Nancy, they switch it off there. And if the family wants to rely on their rabbi, the head of their Hasidic group, whatever, they're allowed to. They make that exception. So that's a little bit.
It was once explained to me, I mean, in the most simplistic terms, that we believe in extending life, but we don't believe in prolonging death. And maybe it comes down to that with the rabbis. If they don't want to prolong death. I'm just telling you how it was once explained to me in a very simplistic way.
Could be, I don't know. Do any of you know any
I'm just
differently?
saying, I mean, I don't think, personally, I would not want to prolong death.
Anybody have any different feelings about it or know anything differently?
I've heard that. I've heard that several times by prominent, respected rabbis that as Nancy, I think, expressed it very well. You don't have to prolong death. But Barry, there's two issues here. One is the relationship of a patient and his decisions as to what care to get and whether he wants a rabbi involved in it. So like Shaarei Tzedek, you could say that. But the real issue that I think you wanted to address is when you have one ventilator and two people. And then, of course, neither of them end up with both. What then? That's the big issue, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, or the scarce resources.
So the Shaarei Tzedek thing that you described didn't discuss that aspect, did it? In New York, and if any of you want any of the articles that I pulled, just send me. I think for just about all of you, I do have your email addresses. I'll be glad to send you the link to the articles that I pulled up. The only thing I didn't pull up completely was the 272 pages of the New York one. They do have an executive summary that's only 7 or 8 pages. The article that I found most helpful, and some of you
may have seen it because it was published. I saw it in the Intermountain Jewish News from Denver. It was an article that was written by Ira Betzo. Ira Betzo, I tend to look up people, you know, when I see an article, what's their background? You know, do they have what kind of qualifications in regard to what they're addressing? Ira Betzo, he's the director of biomedical ethics and humanities program at the New York Medical College. He's a professor at Touro University. He's the UNESCO chair of bioethics. His PhD is from Emory. He has a whole long list of something that I think would impress, you know, all of us about him. He addresses, Jerry, the question that you're saying in his article, and I'm going to go through a little bit of it, and I think, you know, it'll give us things, you know, to get into. In the start of his article, and he, again, for him, it's mostly about New York State. The protocols that New York City hospitals will ultimately adopt are going to clash with the positions held by most, if not all, Orthodox rabbis and with other rabbinic authorities. If two patients show up at the hospital at the same time in need of the only ventilator they have, both hospital guidelines and rabbis assert that physicians should use clinical judgment to determine which patient has a better chance of survival. The problem arises, in his mind, when one patient is already put on a ventilator, okay? So what do you do, Jerry? Hopefully it'll get that. What would you do, Jerry, when, let's say, a patient X is on the ventilator, is 90 years old, okay? He's been on the ventilator for a week and a half. What all of us know from all the television we're watching, the average stay on a ventilator, if you have COVID-19, till you begin to see considerable improvement, is not the normal 4, 5, 6 days, but it's more like 2 weeks. So patient X, who's about 90, has been on the ventilator for close to 2 weeks. And now another person comes in, needs the ventilator. They're 35 years old, okay? In good shape. From a Jewish perspective, what are we supposed to do? There's one ventilator.
Order another
Well, what would you
ventilator.
do?
Well, normally you wouldn't take a patient off a ventilator unless you were already planning to wean them. I mean, you wouldn't just suddenly take somebody off. That's normally. Under these circumstances, I don't know what anybody would do. And that would be a decision made, the doctors would have to. I mean, you'd have to trust the doctors to make the right decision. And I mean, forget the rabbis, the doctors would end up making that decision of whether to remove somebody from a ventilator or not.
Okay. I'm first asking you, again, if any of you want to jump in, what would you do in that case? You know,
You'd have to assess the condition of the 90-year-old. If
the
there
90-year-old has been on it for a week and a half.
has nothing to
Has
do with
shown-
how long. It's
Has
very
shown no improvement whatsoever. But you also know that when there is no improvement in that length of time, in almost every circumstance, according to the things that I pulled up, when you take the person off the ventilator,
they'll pass away.
that's a nice, pleasant, I was going to say they kicked the bucket.
die.
It was as much nicer. So what do you do? You know what the Jewish perspective is, according to the Rambam? And he cites this. The position is grounded in the idea that one life should not be pushed aside for another. In the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides writes that in a situation where a group of Jewish people is being accosted by idolaters who threaten them by saying, quote, "Give us one of you or we will kill him. If you don't, we will kill all of you." He's now quoting straight from the Mishnah Torah. They should all be killed rather than hand over a Jewish life. In essence, halakhically, it is better to allow many to die than to actively participate in killing a single person. The New York guidelines conflict totally, absolutely, with the Jewish perspective.
What's the
Who's
New York
right?
guideline?
Yeah, Alvin, who's right?
I couldn't.
Who's right? Who is right?
It sounds like they're both pretty bad. I would not want to be subjected to
Make that.
that kind of a ruling, to walk into a hospital and know if I get on a Khalila, I get involved and I'm on a ventilator and somebody comes in and they yank me out. I'm 89, so I shouldn't be on the ventilator. If there's I'm unlikely to survive anyhow. So,
You know, one of the things, Alvin, when you say that, I'm smiling, but I was thinking this might be a very different discussion if everybody, you know, in this, the half a dozen of us, were Jeremy's age versus our age. So we kind of may be looking at this protecting our self-interest, okay?
Well, I
Dear,
mean, if it makes anybody feel better, they haven't run out of ventilators yet.
right,
And they're trying, the medical community at this moment in time is trying to keep people off ventilators as long as possible.
yeah.
Trying
Theoretically,
other means to keep them off the ventilator.
yeah,
because-
theoretically, it's a very different position we're in today, as I said at the beginning, than a couple of weeks ago. You also get into, and I think about the thing from, you know, Alabama, where somebody has AIDS, their guidelines, you question tremendously letting them use a ventilator. You know, like I say, I think back with the center, and it's understandable. When the AIDS situation first started, everybody was in a panic. If somebody came through the center doors who we knew they had AIDS, should they be allowed in the building? Of course, if we breathe the same air, we're going to catch AIDS. We didn't know. You know, and it did happen to people in odd ways. Many of you remember Leanne Kleinfeld. She had a close friend in New York who was a nurse in the early days of AIDS. A friend died because of treating a patient. The blood, you know, got on her hand. She had an open cut. The bottom line is, yeah, she passed away. We've since learned how to deal with that. Are there any Jewish authorities from an Orthodox perspective who disagree with the Rambam?
I would imagine there's some, I don't know.
Nope. According to this Ira Bezzo, we'll go from Maimonides. Jerry, Maimonides lived, was it like in around 1100, 1200?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll jump ahead to the 1900s. Moshe Feinstein, okay? He cites in his article, and this was really a very good article, when Feinstein was asked about triage in the 1980s, he wrote, this is in one of his books, that if a patient is already being treated, and Nancy, here in regard to you were saying about the physician, even if physicians incorrectly judge his or her survivability and mistakenly allocated resources to his care, another person with higher chances of survival does not take precedence and resources should not be reallocated.
Well, I think what I was saying is normally they will not, I've never heard of somebody being taken off a ventilator just because they wanted the ventilator.
Okay, all right.
I mean,
What? The New
but there's
York
always been
one,
enough of them.
yeah, the New York one and all the other major ones all seem to have one thing in common, which we would probably all agree with. But again, the Jewish position would differ when you throw in the factor of age. So the New York one devotes an entire chapter, which when their first dealings with the triage involving the first one was done, I think, in 2007, and they've since updated it every 2 or 3 years. So they keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger. It's good for the printers. But at the beginning, they just had a couple of pages dealing with children. It has since expanded. The biggest expansion has been in regard to children, where they now also include, which I didn't even know that you could do this, to ventilate, because I just think of it, I'm not a physician. How do you put the tube down their throat? But when I say infants, you know, as soon as they come out, like there have been a couple of cases apparently, which I guess, you know, it happens because it's almost they're living off their mom, that mothers who have the COVID-19 give birth to babies who have COVID-19. I don't even know how they do deal with a ventilator with them. But in regard to children, children take precedence over almost every other situation from a medical perspective. And again, in New York, the medical people, they take over before the rabbis, whatever. What's the lawyer's problem? The legal problem for the lawyers with giving children priority.
All kinds of peculiarities immediately get involved. And we could go more than the thousands of pages.
Mm.
Am I tuned in?
Give an example.
Yeah, you're in, Alvin.
Okay.
You're in.
Nancy, I saw you wanted to come in. If I may, most respectfully, I can understand English at 20 miles an hour. You're speaking at about 40 miles an hour.
That's New
Slow
York.
down, I could understand all of what you're saying. It sounds very interesting what I got of it.
In
What
the
am
New
I
York
talking about?
one, Alvin, the big difficulty that the attorneys had with the New York piece was putting into the guidelines things to protect the hospitals from being sued for, and it's very obvious, but it didn't hit me until I read it, from being sued by the families of a deceased elderly person who potentially could be taken off a ventilator. 2 weeks have gone by, they're not getting better, take them off to give it to one of, God forbid, our grandchildren, okay? To protect the hospital from being sued for age discrimination.
Well, when you had asked me the question, the first thing I thought about, if I'm the attorney for the hospital, my whole concept is how to protect that hospital from, there's bound to be lawsuits when you're trying to make judgments that only Hashem can make. Nobody ever gonna get it right and they're gonna get sued. But an attorney for a patient, I don't think has any voice
Mm,
while the transaction is going on, while the patient is in the hospital seeking treatment or trying to get onto a ventilator, and there's a limit. I don't think the attorney has any standing except to argue, but the attorney's interest is what is the benefit of my client. A person that brought the attorney into the equation is the person to whom the attorney's attentions and thoughts and perspective is completely focused on that from that point of view, which doesn't help a lot with the issues we're facing.
mm. To go further, he elaborates more, the Sarabezzo, on Moshe Feinstein, and says Feinstein's reasoning is as follows. There is no obligation for the patient to surrender his life for the sake of another. Therefore, when the patient was allocated medical resources, the resource, in effect, the ventilator, became the patient's for as long as the individual maintained life. It is not the case that medical resources are given to the patient contingently by the hospital until the hospital or the medical people, okay, decide to take them away for the sake of another person. Rather, the resources have been committed to the patient for as long as they are keeping him alive without contingency. This is the case even if the second person is in a life-threatening condition and could be saved if given the resources. I think of that, and we're talking about the patient. And I think with everything that's going on, I also find myself, especially when I hear some of them being interviewed, the physicians, the nurses, I have Rahmanis on the people who are put in the position of having to be involved in making these decisions. There was one young doctor last night. He looked, I guess as we get older, everybody begins to look so much younger, like kids. But this guy, a Latino accent, he looked, not even 30. But he said something at the end with tears in his eyes that it made me well up, and I wrote it down. What the guy said, I'm quoting him, "I take every death personally as a sign of my failure." So along with what we're talking about, what the people involved in making these decisions, Gewalt. Jumping back to Moshe Feinstein, I guess we also have to consider in the triage situation, they all talk about life. Somewhere in here, do we get into, from the physician's perspective or science, let's not say physician, science perspective, the religious Jewish perspective, how do we define life? I remember a decision very personally that my brother and I had to make regarding my mother. That is a time after weeks have gone by to say, that term that we all use, that I think it's a terrible term, but to pull the plug, and we justify it in our minds by saying, we're now going to leave it in God's hands. But after we've been told for a couple of days running, it's over. Well, you look at what Moshe Feinstein is saying, no, you leave that machine on. But what do you do if leaving that machine on is causing somebody else's death? Or do we say, thank God we're not on that committee?
Yes.
Thank God I'm not on that committee.
I would
By
say
the way,
that-
how do they make the decisions in the New York hospitals? Who
I think
makes them?
I think Nancy was right when she said you have to leave it up to the medical team. I think when you have limited resources like that, that puts you in a real bind. If you had unlimited resources, this whole discussion would be irrelevant. But with limited resources, automatically you've got to make choices. And the question is, how do you make the choices?
Well, let's deal with it with limited resources. Who makes the
If I were a
choices?
90-year-old and the 34-year-old was my grandchild, I would say, absolutely take me off.
Hmm.
And I'm tempted to say that for almost any case. If you've been on a ventilator for more than a week, it does something to your throat, to your lungs become less well. And the medical decisions have to be really considered. It's not just a question of one for the other, but how beneficial, as you said, Barry, there's a limited time a person can really be kept on a ventilator.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
And
I
they
do
do,
think
and Barry,
issues like that have to be medical.
they do try and take you off. I'm sorry, Debbie, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the same thing. It has to be a medical decision because sometimes if you've been on for 5, 6, 7 days, they may try to wean you off just to see if you can breathe on your own. And the Jewish issue of I thought you put it very well, Nancy, prolonging death rather than allowing life to continue. I think that's a very valid issue too, because allowing a person to stay on the ventilator so long at the age of 90, they possibly won't survive even if their lungs get better because of other issues that are brought into play because of the ventilator.
Yeah, they have to teach you all that stuff all over again.
All that medical stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Nancy, go ahead.
The physicians normally try and wean you from the ventilator as early as possible.
Mhm.
And sometimes they will wean somebody too early and they'll have to be put back on the ventilator. But, you know, being on a ventilator is not anything wonderful. And I think that the physician is the only person that can make the decision because it just involves too much more to allow a rabbi to overcall a physician. I don't see that happening. I really don't. I mean, unless the family at that point says, remove my family member from the ventilator. I don't see the doctor. I mean, maybe if it was his rabbi, I don't know. I don't know the situation in New York, but I find it hard to believe that the medical team is not the one that ultimately makes the decision. And they don't make those decisions lightly. I mean, you know, we happened to have seen the same young doctor as you did last night. And it's a difficult decision, and they're not used to making it so many times. So there's no right. I just don't see a right answer to this. It's just whatever the hospital and the doctors, and if they involve the rabbis, I don't think they do it lightly. So, you know, to me, we're never going to come up with the right answer.
However,
Does any of you know from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, I have, you know, a do not resuscitate thing in my will or whatever you call it, but it's in there. Is a do not resuscitate thing halachically, is that okay?
Yes,
Anybody have any idea?
yes.
It is or it isn't, Jerry?
It is.
Okay.
I mean, I
but
know there's an
since-
ethical will for, you know, Orthodox people, and I believe, and obviously Jerry knows better than I, and I do believe that you can have a do not resuscitate.
By the way, there's a wonderful book. It's a paperback. I think the name of it may be Jewish Ethical Wills, but it was written a bunch of years ago. I had it, but it was wonderful. It just had, you know, a lot of leading Jews over the centuries, what we would describe as their ethical wills. And when you read them, has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it's a
Right,
beautiful
right.
look.
Barry, I
Beautiful
just want to add something from a social work perspective. I think for the sake of the family, oftentimes a rabbi could be called in because the family doesn't want the responsibility of the life or death decision left just to the doctor. It will give them comfort later if a rabbi was involved. And I think from that perspective, it could be that the hospital has included that.
In terms of, you know, for the family's perspective, is the social worker in you know, Debbie, in
Says
the
that
same
for,
vein,
I beg
what they
pardon.
also threw in the New York one, when I asked, you know, the group this morning, who makes that decision? I don't know if they could apply it, let's say during a pandemic, when you could have people who are passing away in front of you, one after another. You know, in one case, one doctor was saying he was never in a situation where in 1 hour he had 6 or 7 of his patients die, you know, where it's so quick. But in the New York one, what's put into it, the decision to terminate in terms of the ventilator, the doctor doesn't make that decision. And this was heavily because, if I remember right, I think there were a couple of people on their committee. One was a retired brigadier general in the Army, psychiatrist, who said that unless you were in the military in a war zone, you can't even begin to imagine the toll it takes on doctors, nurses, the whole medical team, who one after another truly are making life and death decisions. And it's something that some of them, you know, we think of the trauma of, you know, of being in the battlefield. They're in the battlefield. So in the New York one, the attending physician does not make that decision. It's a committee, a triage committee, that makes the decision based totally upon the medical report that they're given, you know, by the attending team. And in a way, they're letting the doctor off the hook from making that decision. It's, I don't know if the doctor, the nurses really feel like they're left off the hook or not, because they have to make that decision initially of, we're passing it on to the committee. So who the heck knows? It's not a great thing, you know, to have to deal with.
Larry,
Yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking, as a result of this, I mean, just thoughts that are stimulated by the discussion, I could imagine in the future hospitals with blinking signs outside the emergency room saying this hospital has a limited supply of ventilators. We are short gloves. We are trying to do everything they can to protect themselves. Or when you go in and you are admitted, today they give you a bunch of papers. Nobody ever reads them. I've taken the trouble of reading a couple of them, and they would have to make that very long. We're notifying you now. We don't have ventilators enough to go around. You may be taken off of a ventilator, all kinds of things to protect the hospital, which is, the hospital's got to do it if they're going to survive. They get sued enough just by being there. They're the first target. They have a deep pocket. But
Yeah. It is, as I say, it's unbelievable that the biggest concern in all of the things that I pulled up is the legalities, Alvin. You're right. They don't want to deal with that. It's also remarkable, I didn't know this, that hospitals are very concerned with wanting to keep, and again, it makes sense, but I never thought that that's a big factor. They want to keep down as much as possible the number of deaths of patients in their hospital. So a lot of times they may refuse admittance to somebody because they know what is going to happen with them. You know,
Barry, generally admittance to the emergency room or hospital is only dictated by availability of physicians in rooms. I've never heard of a hospital turning down somebody that.
I would hope not. I would hope
I've
not.
never ever heard of any hospital that had turned someone down because they were brought to their emergency room and they were dying. The only time, and in fact, I think that even if that case arises, that even if the emergency room is closed, they must take that patient. I'm not 100% sure, and this was a while back, but I think that even when they do close down emergency rooms from time to time, and they're diverted to other and I'm talking about in Memphis, they're diverted to other emergency rooms. But I think if somebody presented at the door in a critical situation that they are admitted.
They have to take them in.
I think so. I'm certainly not the end all be all and the voice of authority on this, but I believe that's the situation, that they have to take them. They can stabilize them and send them to another hospital, but if they present critically there, they have to take them in.
Barry, I have one question. Excuse
Can
me.
even have 2 or 3.
I wondered if you came across a similar question of whether 2 people came to the emergency room at the same time, a 35-year-old and somebody say 70 and up, if there's a ruling on who you take.
That didn't come up, but here, from the way I read the parts of the executive summary, when you say 30, that makes the question much more seriously. In the New York one, where they give the age factor a tremendous amount of credence to push you higher up on the list, it's not 30, it stops at 17.
Wow.
So if you change your question, Elaine, to this non-expert at all, and you said the person is 90 and the other one is 16, I hope I would be the 16-year-old and not the 90-year-old in that case.
Suppose you're 90 and you feel like you're 16.
Yeah. But it's, that's the obvious question. Again, we're blessed in that the country didn't get into that position. The only place apparently where the situation was that dire was the couple of days when they were reporting about the situation at the Navajo reservation, where it was wiping them out. And we don't think of it as, they only had, I think, a couple of ventilators in this whopping 6-room hospital or emergency room area.
Clinic.
And to get the person to where there is a ventilator, they have to airlift them. So then
But that's also a bad example, Barry, because the Navajos revere their elders. So in that case, the elder would always get the ventilator.
Yeah. And I would like to think that we do also. But it's it's wild, you know. You get.
You know, Barry.
I'll call him back.
Barry,
Thank you.
on the legal issues, the government, if I'm not mistaken, the government controls by law who and what circumstances can be sued. So, for example, when HMOs came around, the government said that you cannot sue an HMO for a decision not to give someone care. And that left the HMOs free to make decisions of who lives and who dies. And so the problem is that the hospitals aren't protected. The medical profession, it does not have enough, in my view, enough protection from being sued. and it hinders the profession. And here you have it, very clearly. You don't want them, you want them to make the decision not based on who can sue you because they don't like your decision, but based on completely other factors. So I'll bet you in other countries, you don't have this problem because the United
because
States is very prominent in this issue of giving the allowing lawsuits for all kinds of things.
Yeah, in the New York one, Jerry, they do set, which I guess it falls under the set, what you're talking about. They did set up apparently in New York State with regard to triage decisions. If you sue, what do you call it, Alvin? The limit of what you could sue for? What's the legal term? There's only so much money that you could sue for.
Oh,
it's a cap.
There's a cap, right? Right, there's a cap. So,
But Barry, it might possibly come up from this that you will not be able to sue a hospital or a doctor for treatment during a pandemic, because they're making decisions that they would never otherwise have had to make. I mean, that could be an end result of this too.
yeah, it is, as I say, we're fortunate in that it wasn't to that extent, but who the heck knows? I hope it will not come to that extent. At the end of his article, and we'll finish off with this, he addresses, can people be forced to accept a ventilator? What is it? Christian Scientists, they don't go to doctors or anything, am I right?
Yeah, I think
Am
so.
I correct?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
believe you are.
Yeah, can somebody, refuse something? And this Ira Betzo is basically saying, especially in New York City, there's already a precedent in terms of that you have to follow medical advice. You don't have any choice. The example he cites is what happened about a year ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, that de Blasio signed an executive order compelling all of the students who go to any school that they have to take the measles injection. There was a little outbreak of measles, and people, if you wanted your kid to go to a school, they had to have proof that they were injected, with the vaccine. So I wonder here.
You have two different problems there, Barry.
Yeah.
One is the measles vaccine protects all people. So the government is moving in to protect everybody. The Christian Scientists, and by the way, it's only a small number who actually pursue it to the end, but their religion certainly says that. There you're talking about somebody who wishes to harm themselves or allows someone in their own family harm.
Or someone else in the group.
If I might ask something else, if when you talk about the Jewish ethics, I think a good point was made about the Navajo ethics. These people have to accept that ethical principle. What happens, go back to the case of the old person on the ventilator, and so the Moshe Feinstein says you can't take him off. But what if the alternative is a 35-year-old non-Jewish person?
He addresses that in terms of the Rambam, the Jewish person comes first.
Yeah,
we have difficulty with that.
So I'm sure the New York State thing can consider that. So
that no, they can't. You're right, and we have difficulty even saying it.
Yeah, well,
the problem I have with the problem I have with all of this is I don't see any of these hospitals going through this in New York, going through this 300-page thing with everybody that's in there now. I mean, everything is on the fly, so it's whatever happens. You can debate the ethical from just a physician's ethics to a rabbi's ethics to Orthodox Jewish ethics, but nobody's sitting there saying, you know, oh, what are we going to do with this person on the ventilator? I mean, they're making that decision, oh, right now. Make the decision. And you know, they're not thinking of repercussions or anything else at this moment. So, I mean, this is, you know, a great discussion, but in reality, I don't think, except for your own moral
I
compass.
wonder, Nancy, how much of a lot of these things that you hope will never come up, but where weeks, if not months of people's time are put in to come up with all these regulations so that the hospitals, the people making the decisions, I wonder if the reason they're all doing this is in the simplest way and the most professional term I could use is so that ultimately they're all covering their ass.
Probably.
I followed procedures.
Probably. I mean, listen, we live in a very litigious society.
Mhm.
And yes, I think that maybe you could say that. I think you could say
Yeah.
that these rules were made to cover everybody's ass.
Yeah.
Right.
But in
One thing-
reality, when in the moment, they're going to make the decision that they feel is right, regardless. Nobody's thinking of what are the rules right now. I mean, I guarantee you, these doctors don't have any time. These nurses don't have any time to think, and these hospital administrators, maybe you're thinking, I don't know, that they don't have time to think of, you know, they just do. I mean, I just, you know, you look at them.
Yeah. You wonder, the one thing that I am sure the different unions in the hospitals, the different, you know, the different medical groups are all thinking when you talk about our litigious society, what about the doctor, the nurse, the guy, the gal who mops the floors in a hospital, who contracts the disease? Can they then go back and also, you know, sue the hospital for not providing them with the proper protection?
Well, if you
Bottom
carry
line.
it that far, of course they can sue just as
Yeah.
well as anybody else.
Yeah. Outside of the Sharet Tzedek piece that I was able to find, you wonder in other countries, do they have all these same protocols, or is that our society where everybody and his mother's uncle is so quick, you know, to go to court, to do this, to do that? Who the heck knows?
Most of the other countries, Barry, they have socialized medicine, so it's totally different.
Mhm.
I mean, you don't even really get to necessarily make your own health choices unless you choose to go to a private doctor in some of the countries.
Interesting world. What's the Chinese
Good
curse? We
choice,
should
man.
live in interesting times. Be nice if we lived in dull times. Okay, if
Thank
it's
you so
okay with
much.
everybody, I don't know about you. I want to thank you. I enjoyed it, and it was nice, especially these days, being able to be with a group of people